By mid-morning on April 6th, the Confederate frontal attack had managed to push the Union lines north about a mile from where the fighting began. By this point, the Union had an opportunity to begin setting up a stronger defensive position, specifically the divisions of W.H.L. Wallace and Stephen Hurlbut, who had been further north and not involved in the initial fighting. They had managed to move into position, and W.H.L. Wallace was on the right, here along an old farm lane that didn't have a name at the time of the battle, but veterans after the battle would call the Sunken Lane. Now, as you'll see, it really isn't sunken like, say, the battlefield at Antietam, where there's definitely a depression, but there are places where it offered a little bit of cover. But more specifically, what it gave the Union was a definite spot on the battlefield that was easily recognizable and gave them a place where they could set up their lines. And so around 9 o'clock in the morning, W.H.L. Wallace had set up several brigades in this area with the Joseph Duncan farm in front of him. It was an open field of fire. It was a great place that offered cover here with the Sunken Lane and the woods. And for the better part of the morning and afternoon of April 6th, this was where the Battle of Shiloh would be fought. So we're looking to the west, back toward the road, along the Sunken Road here. That would be south, the Joseph Duncan Field, and then that would be to the east. This line was held throughout a good bit of the day by the men of the 2nd Iowa. You can see their monument there in the distance. And then the 7th Iowa, the center of their regiment, would have been here, and the 12th Iowa there in the distance. Iowa, as a state, lost more men at the Battle of Shiloh than at any other battle during the war. And that was due in large part to these 3 regiments who were fighting here at the Sunken Lane. Throughout the morning and the first several hours of the afternoon, Braxton Bragg ordered no less than 8 frontal assaults on this position at the Sunken Lane. Each one of them was thrown back. He never threw more than a single brigade into the fighting at the time. And for a man who was already beginning to have a reputation for being hated by his men, that certainly did not add to the luster of General Braxton Bragg. What eventually finally broke W.H.L. Wallace's position here at the Sunken Lane was McClernand's men being driven back to their right and Stephen Hurlbut's men being driven back on their left. And suddenly the men here along this farm lane, who had thrown back everything that the Confederates had thrown at them for probably around 6 hours, they were finally forced to fall back. We're now standing on the Confederate side of the Duncan Field, looking there toward the trees, which is where the Sunken Lane is. And that thicket that was held by the Union forces was a real problem for Confederate leadership. 8 frontal assaults had failed to dislodge the Union forces who were stubbornly holding that ground. And so Confederate General Daniel Ruggles was given the job of dislodging these men. So what he did was he started amassing every artillery piece that he could find anywhere in the area, and eventually parts of 11 batteries were brought to this location, 53 guns in all. And you can see some representations of those guns there and along here. It became known as Ruggles Battery. And at the time of the Battle of Shiloh, this was the largest concentration of artillery in one place that had ever existed in North America. They began to shell the Union position. Now, they didn't dislodge the Union forces, but what Ruggles Battery was able to do late in the afternoon of April 6th was to pin down the Union forces who had to take cover and who had to be concerned about this. Just imagine if you are Union forces, you've been fighting for 5 or 6 hours at this point, you've thrown back repeated frontal attacks, and now there are 53 artillery pieces that are shelling your position. It would have just been impossible to withstand psychologically. And so it pinned them down. And as it pinned them down, it allowed the Confederates to begin to surround them. So looking south here from Ruggles Battery, you can see the Union position would have been right there. And the Confederate forces then would have begun to go around them there to the west and around them to the east. And eventually they were able to pin them in that thicket, and the Union began to retreat. Just after 4 p.m., it became obvious to W.H.L. Wallace that he wasn't going to be able to continue to hold his position. So he began to organize a retreat, and as he was overseeing that retreat, he was shot through the head. His staff tried to care for him as quickly as they could, but it was obvious to them that the general was dead or nearly dead. And because of the rapid withdrawal that they were making, they reluctantly made the decision to leave the general's body behind. The fact is, General Wallace was not dead. And throughout the rainy night of April 6th into April 7th, he lay here severely wounded on the field. On the morning of April 7th, when the Union counterattacked and retook this position, they discovered the gravely wounded W.H.L. Wallace, and they were able to take him to Grant's headquarters back in Savannah so he could get care. Now, an interesting side note to this story, the morning of April 6th, as the attack by the Confederates had begun, Wallace's wife arrived to pay a surprise visit to her husband. Of course, the battle having broken out, she was not able to connect with her husband, and so she pitched in and did what she could to help with the streams of wounded that were coming back to Pittsburgh Landing. Word came to her that her husband had been killed and left on the field, and she said afterwards, I prayed for God to give me the strength, and then I carried on caring for the wounded. Well, the next day, when her husband was recovered and brought to the home where he was cared for, she was able to be with him, and he did for a while regain consciousness, and they were able to converse, and she was able to take care of him. But by April 10th, his case had become obvious that it was without hope, and he died. He told his wife that they would meet in heaven. Just maybe 100 yards away from the marker where General W.H.L. Wallace was mortally wounded is one of the markers for the Crescent Regiment out of Louisiana, which was a part of Bragg's Corps in Ruggles' division that was fighting in and around the Hornet's Nest. Interesting tidbit about that regiment one of the privates who fell at the Battle of Shiloh, who was killed on April 7th, the second day of the battle, was Private Samuel B. Todd. Now, that name Todd might ring a bell to you because the First Lady of the United States was Mary Todd Lincoln, and Sam was her brother, killed fighting for the Confederacy. So I'm here on March 30th, and so it's only about a week from the anniversary of the battle. So in this thicket, you see the leaves on some trees, but not too many. It's probably about what it would have looked like at the time of the battle. And you can imagine what the sounds must have been like with all of these trees and all this growth everywhere, with thousands and thousands of bullets whizzing through this thicket, and the sound of artillery and the smoke and the shouts of orders being given by men. It's no wonder that this area was named by the Confederates the Hornet's Nest, because of the sounds that were being made by all of the bullets that were whizzing by and clipping trees and going past their heads. 11 of the 15 regiments in W.H.L. Wallace's division managed to make it out of the Hornet's Nest. They managed to fall back to Grant's last stand line on the ridge at Pittsburgh Landing. But elements of several other units did not make it out, and they were surrounded here in this thicket that today is in an area known as Hell's Hollow. And by around 5:30, it was obvious that the 2,000 or so Union soldiers who were in this thicket were completely surrounded by the Confederate forces. And Benjamin Prentiss made the decision to surrender those elements that were under his command, and that happened right here on this spot. Standing here in the middle of Hell's Hollow in this thicket, and I'm looking around and I'm trying to imagine what it must have been like as a soldier here, because there is absolutely no way that I can tell any sort of direction other than to look up at the sun, or in my case, in modern times, to hear the sound of the road that's nearby. But in 1862, just as I'm looking around, there would have been no way at all to tell which way was which, to be able to connect your lines. As a general, how do you organize that? It's no wonder this was confusion and it was chaos, and the Union men who were here got surrounded and felt that they had no other alternative but to surrender as they were trying to follow their comrades back to the Pittsburgh Landing line, but just everywhere they looked, there were Confederate soldiers. It just must have been a nightmare. The Shiloh Battlefield is a tricky one to negotiate in your mind as far as figuring out where things happen. You go to a place like Antietam or Gettysburg, and it's actually really easy to see large parts of the battlefield and know what is what and understand how it all fits together. But here at Shiloh, you've got these sloping ridges that go from south to north, and you have clearings where there were farms mixed in with large areas of forest, and it's hard to get a sense. And so these interpretive signs do a fantastic job in the different key locations of showing you where you are on the battlefield, telling you what's going on, and they're pointed in the right direction so that you know what's going on. So we're standing right here, and just over in the woods, if there weren't trees, you'd be able to see right over there is the marker where Prentiss surrendered. This is the area where the Union was surrounded. The sunken lane where they had stood for most of the day is down in that direction to the south. And then over here to the north, we're looking at Pittsburgh Landing and the ridge about a mile away. That would be this location right here where the remnants of the Union Army were able to fall back. Part of the set of monuments here around the Hornet's Nest is this monument, which is the Confederate monument. It's about 100 years old, and it has a lot of symbolism involved. These guys here represent the regular soldier, the enlisted man who fought for the Confederacy. These represent the officers. The faces that you see here, and there are 11 of them representing the 11 Confederate states, are facing toward the north and represent the first day's battle when the Confederates felt they were going to achieve victory. You have here a image of Albert Sidney Johnston, who was killed here leading the Confederate Army. And then you have the men with their faces down, facing back toward the south, representing the Confederacy's defeat and falling back to the south and to Corinth on the second day of the battle. In the end, it would be tempting for Union soldiers to have believed their stand here in the Hornet's Nest to have been a failure, but they bought precious, precious time for Grant to organize a defense on Pittsburgh Landing. They held this area for nearly 7 hours. And though the cost was in many lives, dead, wounded, or captured, there's no doubt that what took place here in the Hornet's Nest may have helped save Grant's army and the battle, and perhaps even the war. Now, I should note that modern historians are taking a fresh look at the events that took place here in the Hornet's Nest, and many are beginning to question the traditional narrative of the importance of the stand in this place, of the number of casualties that were taken and inflicted, and whether or not what happened here really saved the battle, whether Beauregard's forces could have indeed pushed on and taken Pittsburgh Landing even without the delay here. But I, for one, believe that the men who died here, they died for a good cause. They died for something that mattered here in the Hornet's Nest.